Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts be acceptable and pleasing in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Now, just as a little side note before I get started, you may have heard those words a minute ago in the call to worship. And so that prayer that I say each week, it actually comes from Psalm 19, from the end of it. And we said that already today. So just so you know where things come from. So this morning I want to begin by talking about something that may seem a little unusual, but it's something that we all have, and that is your brain. Now I'd like everyone to begin by putting a hand on your own head and say this: thank you, God, for gray matter.
Thank you, God, for gray matter.
Now some of us are a little grayer up here than others. But today we're not concerned about the gray stuff that may be on the outside. Instead, I want to talk about the gray stuff that's on the inside. I want to talk about our brains and what they do for us and how we can use them to become better disciples. So here's a little anatomy lesson this morning. You didn't know you were going to get this, but here we are. When you are a biologist or a doctor, you know that brains are composed of 4 structures, and you can see that here. And maybe you can see the colors of that. The blue section on this side is called the frontal lobe. The temporal lobe is in the green. The parietal lobe on the top back is in yellow. The occipital lobe, pink, on the very back. And underneath is the cerebellum that runs into your brainstem and your spine. Got it?
Got it.
Now we all have these parts in our brains. Even if we don't know as much about them as some other body parts, they are still up there every day doing their work to help us. Now, let's go a little more into detail, because in the front of the frontal lobe is something that we call the prefrontal cortex. Still with me? Now what does this do? It helps us with motor skills like walking or raising our arms, voluntary movement. It also helps with something called executive function. In other words, predicting the consequences of our behavior, deciding what's good and bad and how that might affect us. It also helps us with social skills. The prefrontal cortex also helps us with our feelings and with the memories associated with these feelings, so that with this part of the brain we know and remember what causes us joy, or happiness, or fear, or anger, and I'll say more about that in a minute. Okay, so that is the what part? Or the prefrontal cortex. We're a little bit vague, folks. I promised there'd be a quiz on the Greek words from last week. There may be a quiz on this as well. All right, so this green part, which really isn't green, the whole brain is green, but we call this part the temporal lobe on the sides. Now this is the place where our brains process hearing and seeing and language, and it's also responsible for long-term memory. And hiding deep inside this temporal lobe is a little thing called the amygdala. Now it looks a little bit like an almond in shape, and actually this is where the name came from. Another Greek word, amygdala, means almond. That's a good way to remember it. Now, these amygdala, it has a primary role for memory and decision-making and for our emotional responses. And so that fear and anxiety and aggression, all these things filter through this part called the amygdala. Now, this is where our brains decide in an instant, flight or fight. Now, you may be wondering why I'm talking all about brains today. My goal is not to turn us into zombies, but instead to ask us to pay attention to how we react to things. Because it seems to me when we're faced with situations in life, both good and bad, we make choices. And knowing how our brains work while we're doing this, sometimes even quicker than we realize, knowing how they work may help us to see how we react in a given situation. And knowing what happens inside us can make a big difference in our success or failure as Jesus' disciples. Now, in last week's reading from Mark 6, we focused on the verbs, the actions, all the things that were going on when Jesus and his disciples went out to serve in the world. Now this week our focus is slightly different because the lesson isn't filled with all kinds of actions. Instead, it is a conversation. Conversation between Jesus and his disciples, in which Jesus is pushing them in order to prepare them for a difficult situation that he sees coming. Now Jesus does this, I think, because he knows that his disciples are going to be faced with choices. He knows that they may make mistakes along the way, and so what he's doing in this passage, he's telling them, he's showing them by his example that they must use their brains in order to continue the work of building the kingdom of God after he's gone. Now on the surface, our first impression about this story from Mark might be that it has a religious or theological purpose. In other words, we're supposed to learn something deeper and more profound about who Jesus is as the Messiah and the Savior. If we're looking for that information, of course, we can find it there. But I want to invite us today to look instead at the way that Jesus and Peter interact with each other. Because it's here that we see how to succeed and how to fail, and ultimately how to succeed again at being a disciple. So if we turn to the passage that we read a moment ago. Oh look, there's another brain graphic. I should have had that all this time. Memorize it? Good. Now we're on there. So on to Mark 8. Now this begins, the lesson begins with Jesus as in the role of a teacher. He's asking questions to his students, and the disciples, of course, are giving answers. So he starts with two questions. First he says, who do people say that I am? And they answer, well, some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, others some other prophet. And then Jesus' second question, who do you say that I am? And Peter, right away, he knows the answer. You, Lord, you are the Messiah. Next we see Jesus teaching again, and he expands upon this idea that Peter gives. What does it mean to be the Messiah? Well, Jesus says the Son of Man, or the Messiah, must suffer, must be rejected, must be killed, and then rise again. Now this is the theological or the religious thing that we can learn from this passage. But here's again where I want us to pay attention. Where things get really interesting is what Peter does next with this information. Peter rebukes Jesus. He pulls him aside, and with energy and with emotion, he tells Jesus off. Can you imagine? Now what happens next is just as intense. With the exact same language, Jesus rebukes Peter. He says, "Get behind me, Satan. You do not have your mind upon divine things, but instead upon earthly and human goals." And then Jesus says to the entire crowd, the entire group of disciples who are there, if anyone wants to follow me, you need to do what I'm going to do. Deny yourself, take up a cross, and follow. Now I've been wondering this week a lot about Peter's reaction. And I'm curious why he acts the way he does toward Jesus. By any measure, Peter's response is a failure. And not a failure of Peter's theology, because he gets the right answer at the beginning. But instead, Peter has a failure of nerve. Now we should notice that at the beginning of our lesson, Peter's the one of all the disciples who correctly answers Jesus' question, who do you say I am? So Peter knows that Jesus is the Messiah. But I wonder why, in a matter of moments, does he pull Jesus aside and begin to rebuke him and warn him to stop this work? Now in this moment, Peter's deep feelings, they come to the surface. It could be that his love for Jesus is causing him to worry. It could be that he has this flight instinct. He's afraid of danger and pain. And he's not wrong. In Mark 14, when the crowd arrests Jesus, all the disciples run away, and Peter himself denies knowing Jesus. So Peter has a legitimate fear that he too will be arrested. It could also be Peter's just afraid to face change. He doesn't know what he's going to do if Jesus is gone. Now I believe in this passage that Peter understands clearly what Jesus is teaching and saying. But at the same time, another part of his mind rebels and it takes over. It refuses to accept Jesus' attempts to prepare him for the changes that are coming. Now, if we want to use our modern-day brain language, Peter's prefrontal cortex is processing the information, but his amygdala is pumping out emotions, fear and worry and anger. It is screaming, danger, danger. And this part of Peter's brain, it takes over and floods his other thoughts and causes him to react badly. So that in that moment, Peter fails as a disciple, fails to be who Jesus wants him to be. Now, I'm no psychologist. And even if I were, this story in Mark doesn't really provide us with enough information about Peter's thoughts and his feelings, about his personality, his hopes, his dreams, and fears. So what I'm suggesting today is not a diagnosis. I don't think Peter needs therapy or medication. At the same time, when Mark describes Peter's state of mind, he uses a very strong word, epitimato. Here's your Greek for the day. Now this word means to rebuke, to warn, to speak seriously to someone so as to prevent them or restrain them from acting. Peter is very intense at this moment when he takes Jesus off to the side to talk to him. As I said, I'm no psychologist, but if Peter came to me as his pastor and told me about his reaction to Jesus and Jesus' response to him, I would tell him that his intense reaction is showing him something he ought to pay attention to. It's showing him something that maybe he wasn't even aware of that caused his mind and all of him to respond in this way. I would ask Peter to slow down and consider what might be motivating him. Perhaps he's full of worry about what would happen to Jesus. Perhaps he's full of fear. What if the Romans put not only Jesus, but everyone on the cross? Maybe he's angry. Why would Jesus lead them this far and then abandon them? Maybe he's alarmed. Why is Jesus so interested in death? It seems a strange fixation. Is there something wrong? And what's going to happen if Jesus dies to all the people who follow? What will happen to me? Peter might be asking. We ask ourselves these same questions. So today, I'm interested in Peter's motivation, why he does what he does, because it seems to me that this motivation holds an important truth for us as we seek to live as Jesus' disciples today. You see, just like Peter, we all will have experiences in our lives, some of them good and positive, and some of them unpleasant and fearful. How we respond to these experiences, this determines the course of our lives and whether in the long run we will find success or failure. So what I'm asking us today is to pay a little more attention to why we do the things we do, why we say the things we say. I want us to be more centered and less frazzled by life so that we can act instead of react, so that we can find more success and less failure as people and as Jesus' disciples. So let me be clear. I'm not saying that emotions are bad and rational thought is the only way to live. This isn't a matter of thinking versus feeling. There will be times when we feel anger and fear and worry, and for very good reasons. What I'm asking us to do when these feelings come is to pay attention to why we're having them. If we're angry about injustice in the world, that means we have a moral center. If we are afraid of dangerous things, that means we have a healthy sense of caution. If we are worried about a diagnosis because we don't know what will happen with our health, well, friends, that's only normal. But there are times when these same feelings are caused by other, more negative sources. Sometimes politicians and political pundits stoke our fears for ratings and for their own profit, and we find ourselves angry and divided from one another. Sometimes we see stories of violence on TV, and we find ourselves paralyzed with fear. Sometimes we worry about getting old, about our bodies wearing out and failing, and we withdraw inside ourselves instead of embracing and savoring life and all that it has to offer. Sometimes we even get so attached to the way things are. We get so comfortable with an idea of how things used to be that we don't want to change, and we try to avoid problems and situations. So much so that they get out of hand. So today I'm asking us to pay attention to how we act and how we react to experiences, to be aware of our motivations, and to challenge ourselves to identify and work these uncomfortable feelings so we can grow as people and so we can be at peace with ourselves and with God. Now, all of this, I believe, will have an effect on how we live as Jesus' disciples. In our lesson today, Peter goes from great success to serious failure, all in the space of 5 verses. Elsewhere in Mark, we see that Peter goes from success to failure and then succeeds again. He follows Jesus and is sent out with the 12 to preach and heal, but then he chases away the little children who are coming to Jesus. Peter sees Jesus transfigured on a mountaintop, but then he falls asleep in the Garden of Gethsemane. He runs away and denies Jesus, swearing up and down that he does not know the man. But Peter also sees the empty tomb. He meets the risen Christ, and he goes on to do amazing things. My point is that Peter has both success and failure and success as a disciple of Jesus, and the same will be true for us. But when we fail, when we don't do the things we could do, when we aren't the people that we might and know we ought to be, friends, we can keep trying. We can learn to do better. And paying attention to our own motivations, this will set us up for success in the future. At the end of our lesson, Jesus turns to the crowd, and he says to them, if anyone wants to become my follower, you must deny yourself and take up a cross and follow him. Jesus knows this is hard, and yet he knows that life requires us to be resilient and adaptable and able to change. This is true for us as individuals, for our families, and for our churches, as we seek to be faithful to God's work in this present age. So let's pay attention to how we respond to Jesus' call to follow. Let's set our minds on divine things so that God's peace may fill our lives and God's love may shine through us to the world.